Hello, my name is Gilbert Garcia. Welcome to San Pasqual Battlefield State Historic Park, located in Escondido, California, the ancestral homeland of the first people, the Kumeyaay. Due to COVID-19, our on-site Battle Day event has been canceled this year. In lieu of this, we have created a 15-minute video presentation about the Battle of San Pasqual, the bloodiest battle fought in California during the Mexican-American War. Please enjoy and hope to see you at next year's Battle Day.
Following his election in 1845, James K. Polk had one major goal in mind for his term as president: to stretch America across the continent all the way to the Pacific. Polk believed that access to the Pacific coast would greatly increase the country's ability to trade with Asia and conduct foreign affairs. His presidency ignited decades of Western territorial expansion, displacing and disrupting countless indigenous communities. President Polk's attempts to purchase the northern half of Mexico for $30 million had failed, and the tense relationship between the two countries had reached its breaking point. Each had a different notion of where the boundaries of their territories ended, with the U.S. insisting the border was marked by the Rio Grande River, while Mexico held that their territory ended at the Nueces River. On May 13, 1846, Congress passed legislation formalizing the war between Mexico and the United States. The resulting conflict played out across Mexico's northern territories, with American troops later moving further into the interior of Mexico, eventually laying siege to Mexico City and Veracruz. While General Taylor and later General Scott were sent to invade the interior of Mexico, General Kearny was placed in command of the Army of the West and sent to capture New Mexico, from where they would continue their journey west into Alta California, or Upper California. Kearny and his troops departed from Fort Leavenworth, Missouri in June of 1846. Kearny and his men arrived in New Mexico, famously taking the city of Santa Fe without a single shot being fired. Following this victory, Kearny ordered Colonel Alexander Doniphan to take a portion of the army further into Mexico to the state of Chihuahua. A twist of fate led to Kearny running into Kit Carson, the famous scout, who informed him that Commodore Robert Stockton had successfully captured the coast of San Diego. This was the truth. However, it later became clear that the Mexican residents of California would not relinquish their control of the interior without going to battle. Carson also warned him that the difficult trek through the desert and the mountains on their way to California would be even more difficult to traverse due to the size of Kearny's army and the amount of supplies they would need to sustain and arm them. As a result, Kearny sent a majority of his forces back to Santa Fe, leaving him with 100 dragoons, or mounted cavalry. By the time the Army of the West reached Southern California, they were exhausted and running low on supplies, having left most of them behind before crossing the expansive desert. The horses and mules that had managed to survive the trek were weak with hunger, as were the men. As Lieutenant Emery wrote in his journal, "We are still to look for the glowing pictures drawn of California. As yet, barrenness and desolation hold their reign." Leaving behind the harsh desert regions of California's interior, they made camp at Warner's Ranch. General Kearny sent word to Commodore Stockton, who was currently stationed in San Diego, asking for reinforcements and more information on the status of the conflict thus far. While camped out at the ranch, the men discovered that they were close enough to steal a herd of horses and mules from the enemy general. The captured mules would help the Americans tremendously. A cross between a female horse and a male donkey, mules were stronger than horses and could go for longer without grazing, which would prove invaluable to the men as they continued on their trek. On the 5th of December, the reinforcements Kearny had requested from Commodore Stockton arrived. Captain Archibald Gillespie, along with Lieutenant Edward Beale and 38 Marines, had managed to penetrate the California blockade. However, Gillespie's forces had not gone unseen on their trek from San Diego to Rancho Santa Maria. word of their march had spread. As the troops convened at Rancho Santa Maria, soaked with rain and mud, they began to gather intel on who exactly they were up against. At the time, the Mexican citizens of Alta California, or Californios as they were called, were known to be among the best horsemen in the world. In a time and place where cattle ranching was the most profitable profession, the connection between man and horse was a bond that began as soon as a boy could walk. While they were not the official Mexican army, the band of Californios who would meet the Army of the West in the San Pasqual Valley were primarily the sons of wealthy rancho owners, heavily invested in protecting their hold on Southern California's ranching economy. With a formidable enemy looming in the fog ahead, Kearny was determined to get a better understanding of the number of troops in their command. Led by Andres Pico, the younger brother of Pio Pico, the former governor of Mexican Alta California, the Californios assembled and prepared for a fight. Pico's forces made camp in the village of San Pasqual, evicting the Kumeyaay residents into the rainy night. Early in the morning of December 6th, under Kearny's direction, a scouting party descended into the valley to assist the opposing forces as they made camp. Led by Rafael Machado, the Californio scout working under Gillespie's command, they made their way with caution, only to have their presence made known by a small dog, catching their scent and alerting the Californios. Pico responded by sending out scouts of his own, who came across a U.S. Army blanket and the jacket of one of the American Dragoons. Having lost the element of surprise, the Americans had no other choice. The battle began in the early morning hours of December 6th, as the rain died down and the moon rose to illuminate the field. Mounted on their underfed and half-trained mules and horses, they marched into battle. As the Americans advanced, a crucial order from Kearny to Johnston was misunderstood. Instead of trotting, Captain Johnston relayed the wrong message to his dragoons. Charge. A shot rang out across the valley, and Johnston fell from his horse. Kearny's aide-de-camp was dead, the first casualty of a bloody early morning battle. Even more demoralizing was the realization that their weapons wouldn't fire, their powder soaked by rain. As a result, they resorted to using their guns as clubs, requiring them to come within close range of the enemy in order to inflict any damage. Their sabers, too, would require them to come within close range before striking an enemy. Adding to the disadvantage of the American troops, the Californios were armed with their signature weapon, the lance. The Californios' lances were both practical and deadly. Iron blades of 9 to 10 inches were attached to 9-foot wooden poles. This allowed them to inflict damage upon their enemy without having to come as close as an arm's reach. In addition, their riadas, or leather lassos, allowed them to rope and drag their enemies from their mounts. After the initial clash, the Californios split into two groups, feigning a retreat. The Dragoons, now led by Captain Benjamin Moore, followed in pursuit, as Gillespie writes.
After a pursuit of over 1.5 miles, the Dragoons came upon the enemy in the open plain, where they made a stand, evidently having observed the scattered position of our force. As we came up, I saw a party of some 25 or 30 Dragoons slowly turning before a superior force of the enemy. Sword in hand, I dashed forward to them, crying, "Rally, men! For God's sake, rally! Show a front! Don't turn your backs! Face them! Face them! Follow me!"
Utilizing their experience as expert cattle ranchers, the Californios began to circle and surround the Dragoons that had pursued them. Moore attempted to shoot Pico, but his weapon failed to fire a powerful shot. Pico quickly slashed Moore with his saber, while his lancers ran their weapons into Moore, knocking him to the ground. With nothing to defend himself with but a broken saber, he was shot in the head. Meanwhile, Carson retreated to the edge of the battlefield. Here, he hid behind boulders and, upon finding that his cartridges were mostly dry, began to shoot at the Californios. Kearny, mounted on a slower mule and following in the wake of the Dragoons, was thrown from his mount and stabbed with a lance. Seeing this, Lieutenant Emery came to his aid and fought off the lancer. Gillespie, moments after he called his men to rally against the enemy, was knocked off his horse by a lancer and was stabbed in the face and the chest. Staggering to his feet, blood gushing from his chest, he turned his attention to the howitzer. He approached the surrounding men, who were struggling in vain to light the cannon. Gillespie pulled from his pocket a dry match and lit the fuse, handing the match to a dragoon before collapsing. Finally, the Californios receded, but not without capturing the second howitzer with their riatas. The battle had lasted no more than 30 minutes, but the destruction was palpable. Observing the battle from the hillsides was a young Kumeyaay woman, Felicita. She was the daughter of Ponto, the leader of the Kumeyaay in San Pasqual. Decades later, her account of the battle was recorded and published.
Early one rainy morning, we saw soldiers that were not Mexicans come riding down the mountainside. They looked like ghosts coming through the mist, and then the fighting began. The Indians fled in fear to the mountains on the north side of the valley, from where they looked down and watched the battle. All day long they fought. We saw some Americans killed and knew they were in a bad way. That afternoon, Ponto, my father, called his men together and asked them if they wished to help the Americanos in their trouble. The men said they did. When darkness was near, Ponto sent a messenger to the Mexican chief, telling him to trouble the Americans no more that night, else the Indians would help the Americans. And the Mexican chief heeded the message, and the Americans were left to bury their dead and to rest, because of my father's message. The Americanos do not know of this, but my people know of it.
Ponto's request was honored, and the Americans were given time to bury their dead in a mass grave at twilight. 21 Americans were dead, and at least 15 more were wounded. On the Californio side, only one death was recorded, with at least 15 wounded. Kearny, severely injured and exhausted, led his men away from the battlefield to recuperate. The Americans stopped at nearby Rancho San Bernardo to water their horses and treat their sick. Finding no grass at the semi-abandoned rancho, they moved their forces closer to the riverbed. Seizing the opportunity, the Californios blockaded the Americans on the rocky hill, preventing them from retrieving water or food. As a result, the Americans resorted to consuming their weary mules that they had captured a few days prior, giving the hill its current name, Mule Hill. With nightfall, a daring plan was executed. A Kumeyaay scout named Chamacta would lead Carson and Beale through the blockade and down to San Diego, where reinforcements could be called in. They successfully escaped detection by the Californios, but it was not without cost. Beale and Carson, having removed their shoes to soften their footsteps, made the 30-mile trek barefoot. Once they arrived, they alerted Commodore Stockton and his men, who came to relieve the bedraggled Army of the West. The Battle of San Pasqual was over, but not without cost to both sides. The Californios had now lost their control of northern San Diego. Historians still debate over which side can claim victory over the battle, with the majority believing that the victory was on the Mexican side due to the loss of life on the side of the Americans. However, as a result of the battle, Southern California fell under American control. Although the war wouldn't officially end until 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the conflict in San Diego was over. Pico continued to be involved in politics after the transfer of power, serving as a state assemblyman and a state senator in the early American period. Like Pico, most Californios eventually became U.S. citizens, in many cases adopting American dress and politics while retaining their cultural heritage. In 1847, Ponto lent Commodore Stockton a large amount of oxen and horses for a conflict in Los Angeles, for which he was never repaid. He led his community for 30 years and pushed for their right to remain in the valley into his senior years. The Kumeyaay residents of the valley were unable to remain in their homeland, as a treaty intended to protect their rights to the land failed to pass the newly formed California Senate. President Grant issued an executive order in 1870, granting the Kumeyaay their land as a reservation, but this only lasted a year before the order was rescinded due to pressure from white settlers. In 1878, county officials forced out the last remaining members of the community, with many only returning in the last 70 years. Today, the San Pasqual Band of Mission Indians continues to practice their traditions and occupy the land of their ancestors. As a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, more and more Americans began to migrate to the West Coast. Major developments such as the discovery of gold in California and the creation of the Homestead Act further encouraged settlers to make the trek. In 1850, California was officially added to the Union, with its newfound status as a state serving to further amplify the unrest that was boiling in the country, an unrest that would culminate in the Civil War a decade later.